The locksmith's van was still parked in my driveway when I turned onto Hargrove Street. I had been gone for 6 hours. 6 hours to bury my mother, to stand at a graveside in February rain and watch the people who had known and loved her say goodbye to the woman who had raised me, who had made my lunch every day until I was 12 and thought I was too old for that, who had called me every Sunday without fail for 31 years. 6 hours. The service, the burial, the gathering at my aunt's house where people told stories about my mother that made me laugh and cry at the same time in the specific way of grief that is also gratitude. I had left my house at 8 in the morning. My in-laws had arrived, they later told the police, at 9:15. The locksmith's van was white with a blue stripe. I can still describe it in exact detail because I sat at the end of my street for several minutes looking at it before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. Not the van specifically, the implication of the van. The fact of a locksmith at my house on the day of my mother's funeral when I had told no one to call a locksmith, had authorized no work on my home, and had left the house locked that morning with my keys in my coat pocket exactly where they always were. I called my attorney before I got out of the car. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I was looking at. She said, "Do not go inside. Do not approach them. Stay in your car and tell me what you see." I told her. She said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not move." I did not move. My in-laws were still inside my house when Diana Reeves, family law attorney, pulled up behind the locksmith's van 23 minutes later. They had no idea she was coming. They had no idea that the moment they changed those locks, they had walked directly into the most prepared legal response a grieving woman has ever assembled from a church parking lot. But I need to take you back. Because the day of my mother's funeral was not the beginning of this story. It was the day the preparation I had been building for 4 months finally had something to be used against. My name is Nora Ellison Vance. I am 34 years old. I am a high school English teacher in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I have spent the past 11 years trying to convince teenagers that language is the most powerful tool they will ever hold. I believe this completely. I have believed it since I was a teenager myself, reading in the bedroom of the house my mother kept for us on the east side of the city, in the particular quiet of a home where books were treated as furniture. Essential, everywhere, never questioned. My mother's name was Cora Ellison. She was 63 years old when she passed, which is not enough years by any accounting that makes sense. She had been a medical records administrator for 30 years, the kind of job that is invisible until something goes wrong and then becomes the most important job in the room. She was organized and precise and had a laugh that you could hear from another floor of a building. She had raised me alone after my father left when I was 4. With the specific combination of fierce competence and warm presence that I have spent my adult life trying to understand well enough to replicate with mixed results. She was my best friend. I know that is what people say and that the phrase has been worn smooth by overuse, but I mean it in the literal sense. She was the person I called first for everything, the person whose opinion I could not make a major decision without, the person who knew every version of me from the one who cried at every sad movie to the one who had stood in front of a room of 30 teenagers every day for 11 years and meant every word she said. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in September. She was gone by January. 4 months. Some diseases give you years. This one gave us 4 months, which was enough time to say everything that needed to be said and not enough time to be ready for any of it. I was married to a man named Reed Vance for 3 years. We had met in a graduate education program, married quickly in the way of people who are certain and then find out over time what certainty costs, and had been living in the house Reed had purchased before we married. A 3-bedroom craftsman on Hargrove Street that was registered in his name, that had been registered in his name throughout our marriage, and that had been the subject of the most significant legal question of the 4 months my mother was dying. I need to tell you about Reed's family before I tell you about Reed. Because the Vance family is the kind of entity that cannot be understood through any individual member but only through its collective operating logic. Reed's parents were Philip and Sandra Vance. Philip was 61, a retired bank manager with the specific personality of a man who had spent 40 years telling other people what they qualified for and had brought that orientation home with him when he retired. Sandra was 58, warm on the surface in the specific way of surfaces that have been carefully maintained, with a talent for delivering damaging information in a tone so pleasant that you sometimes needed several minutes to fully receive what had been said. They had 2 other children, Reed's older brother Garrett, 38, and his younger sister Kelsey, 29, and the family operated as a unit in a way that I had initially found appealing and had come to understand, over 3 years of marriage, was less about closeness and more about consolidated decision-making. The Vances decided things together. What this meant in practice was that Philip and Sandra decided things and the others aligned, and any perspective from outside the unit, any perspective from, for example, a woman who had married into the family, was incorporated only insofar as it confirmed what had already been decided. I had been trying to understand my place in the Vance family's operating logic for 3 years. The answer I learned during the 4 months my mother was dying was that I did not have one. The first indication came in October, 6 weeks after my mother's diagnosis. I had been spending significant time at my mother's apartment, not every night but 4 or 5 nights a week, managing her medications and her appointments and the administrative avalanche of a serious illness, driving her to her treatments, sitting with her in the evenings watching the television programs she had always loved and that had taken on a new significance in the context of their finitude. I was exhausted and grief-stricken and doing the thing that people do when the person they love most is dying, which is that they show up regardless of the cost. Reed was not unkind about this. He expressed concern. He brought me food sometimes when I came home late. He told me on multiple occasions that he wished he could do more. What he did not do, and this is the detail that told me everything I needed to know about the year I was inside, was ever suggest coming with me to my mother's apartment. Not once, in 4 months, did he offer to sit with us to help with her medications, to drive her to an appointment, to be present in the way that someone who loved you would be present when the person you loved most was dying. He was sympathetic at a distance. The Vances were sympathetic at a greater distance. Sandra called twice a month. The calls were warm and expressed concern and were exactly 20 minutes long, which told me they had been planned rather than felt. Philip called once in November to ask how things were going, and in the course of that call asked whether I had considered what the situation would mean for my availability to the family, specifically whether the time I was spending at my mother's apartment was affecting my ability to contribute to the family household. I sat with that question for several seconds. Then I said, "My mother is dying, Philip." He said, "Of course. Of course. I just mean practically speaking." I ended the call shortly after. I told Reed about it. He said his father hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I said it had sounded like he was asking me to prioritize the family household over my dying mother. Reed said his father was from a different generation. I said that was not an answer. We did not resolve that conversation. We moved on from it because moving on was the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance had always been how we handled things that were actually significant. In November, I had a conversation with my mother that changed the direction of everything. She was having a good day. The good days were fewer by then, but when they came they were precious in a specific way that made you want to stop time inside them. We were sitting in her living room with tea and the particular ease of 2 people who have been comfortable in each other's presence for 31 years. And she said, unprompted, in the tone she used when she had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it, "Nora, I need to ask you something about your situation at home." I said, "What situation?" She said, "Your legal situation. The house. Something happened between you and Reed." I said, "Mama, nothing is happening between me and Reed." She said, "I'm not saying something is happening. I'm saying something could. And you're going to be dealing with enough when I'm gone without also being unprepared for what the people around you might do." She had always been precise. I said, "What are you worried about?" She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I'm worried about what happens to you if that marriage doesn't hold. The house is in his name. Your name isn't on the deed. You've been there 3 years and your name isn't on anything. Do you know what that means legally?" I said I had a general understanding. She said, "Go find out specifically. Today, not eventually. Go find out what you're entitled to and what you need to protect and what happens if someone decides you're not welcome in that house. Because I won't be here to help you figure it out after." I looked at my mother. My precise, organized, medical records administrator mother who had spent 30 years making sure the right information was in the right place at the right time and who was sitting in her living room with a terminal diagnosis and her primary concern was making sure I was legally protected. I said, "Okay, Mama. I'll find out." I made an appointment with Diana Reeves the following week. Diana Reeves had been practicing family law in Greensboro for 19 years. She was 52, direct in the way of someone who has spent 2 decades in a field where directness is an act of respect, and she had an office with a wall of family law texts and a single framed photograph on her desk. Herself and what appeared to be 2 teenagers at a mountain overlook somewhere, that told me she understood the difference between the professional and the personal dimensions of the work she did. I told her my situation completely. The house in Reed's name. My 3 years of marriage. The contributions I had made, financial and otherwise, to the household. My mother's illness and the time I had been spending away from the house. The conversation with Philip. The pattern I had been observing in the Vance family's attitude toward me, which was difficult to describe precisely but which I would characterize as a consistent and growing sense that I was a provisional member of the household rather than a full one. Diana listened without interrupting. When I finished she said, "Let me walk you through your legal position under North Carolina law." In North Carolina, she explained, a house purchased before a marriage remains the separate property of the spouse who purchased it. My name was not on the deed. I had made no documented financial contributions to the purchase price. I had contributed to the household, groceries, utilities, the general expenses of shared life. But these contributions, while real, did not automatically translate to property interest without specific legal steps having been taken. She said, "What this means practically is that in the event of a separation, you have a claim to equitable distribution of marital assets acquired during the marriage, but the house itself, as separate property, would likely remain Reed's unless you could demonstrate that your contributions had significantly increased its value in a documented way." I said, "And if he wanted me to leave?" She said, "He would need to follow a legal process. He could not simply change the locks or physically remove you. You have rights as a marital resident even without your name on the deed. But those rights require enforcement, and enforcement requires resources and preparation." He said, "I want to be honest with you about something. The conversation you described with your father-in-law, the pattern you're describing in how the family relates to you, these are things I've seen before. They sometimes precede an attempt to move a spouse out of a marital home, particularly when there is a circumstance, like a death in the family, that creates an opportunity for the other party to act while the spouse is distracted and vulnerable." I sat very still. She said, "I'm not predicting that. I'm telling you that if it were to happen, the people who come through it with their rights intact are the people who have prepared in advance." She asked if I wanted to prepare in advance. I said yes. What Diana and I did over the following 3 months, through December through January through the final weeks of my mother's life, was build a complete legal documentation of my marital residence and my contributions to the household. Every joint expense I could document, grocery receipts, utility contributions, home maintenance I had coordinated and paid for, the specific improvements to the house I had managed, a kitchen renovation I had researched and overseen, a garden I had designed and planted, records of work I had contracted and supervised, photographs of every room, dated, time-stamped by the phone's metadata, documentation of my physical presence in the home, not paranoid surveillance but the natural record of a person who lived somewhere, mail addressed to me at the Hargrove Street address, medical records listing it as my address, my voter registration, my school employment records all listing the same address. A contemporaneous journal I had begun keeping in November at Diana's suggestion. Brief daily entries documenting my presence in the home, significant conversations, and anything that struck me as relevant to the legal question of my marital residence. The journal was not dramatic. It was factual. Dates, people present, what was discussed. The ordinary record of an ordinary life that would, if needed, establish clearly and in dated detail that I had been a full resident of that home for 3 years. Diana also walked me through my rights as a marital resident. What I was entitled to. What process would be required if anyone attempted to interfere with my access to the home. What constituted an illegal lockout under North Carolina law, which is unambiguous. A spouse who is a legal marital resident cannot be locked out of the marital home without a court order, regardless of who holds title to the property. She put her number in my phone under the designation Diana. Call first. She said, "If anything happens, anything at all related to that house, you call me before you do anything else." I said, "Hey." She said, "I mean before you get out of the car." She had been in this work for 19 years. She had seen what people did when they thought they had a window. I had not fully understood in November what window she was anticipating. I understood on the morning of my mother's funeral. My mother died on the 21st of January. She went the way she had done everything, with more dignity and less drama than the situation required, in her own apartment, with me beside her, in the early morning before the day had fully decided what it wanted to be. I sat with her for a long time after. Then I called the people who needed to be called in the order they needed to be called, and began the process of the administrative reality of loss, which is one of the cruelties of grief, that the moment you most need stillness is the moment the world requires you to be most functional. Reed came to the apartment. He was present and kind in the specific limited way he was present and kind, and I was grateful for it in the specific limited way you are grateful for something that is less than you needed but more than nothing. His family did not come. Sandra sent flowers. Philip sent a text that said thinking of you, which required very little of him and received very little acknowledgement from me. The funeral was on a Saturday, 8 days after she passed. I left the house on Hargrove Street at 8 in the morning. Reed told me he was not feeling well. A stomach thing, he said, and I looked at his face and believed him, and also did not entirely believe him in the way that you sometimes hold two incompatible assessments simultaneously because the full truth of a situation has not yet arrived. I left. I do not know exactly when they arrived. Philip and Sandra and Garrett, who drove from Raleigh. I know it was sometime around 9:15 based on what the neighbor across the street told me later. Mrs. Patricia Hawthorne, 68 years old, retired, home every morning at 9:15 for her tea, who watched from her front window as a second car arrived at my house and 3 people she did not recognize let themselves in with a key. Reed's key. He had given them his key. I do not know the full sequence of what happened inside. I know the locksmith arrived at 10:30 based on his own records, which became relevant later. I know that by the time I turned onto Hargrove Street at 2:17 in the afternoon, the van was still in my driveway and the work was complete. My locks had been changed while I was burying my mother. I sat at the end of my street and looked at the white van with the blue stripe, and I thought about my mother sitting in her living room in November saying, "Go find out specifically. Do you know what that means legally?" I knew what it meant legally. I called Diana. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I was looking at. She said, "Do not go inside. Do not approach them. Stay in your car and tell me what you see." I told her everything. The van. The timeline. The fact that Reed had said he was not feeling well and had not come to my mother's funeral. The fact that his parents and his brother had apparently been inside my house. She said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not move." I did not move. I sat in my car at the end of Hargrove Street on the day of my mother's funeral, and I thought about grief and preparation and the specific cruel efficiency of people who choose the moment of maximum vulnerability to act. And I held my phone in my hand and I waited. Diana arrived in 23 minutes, which was faster than she had promised. She pulled up behind the locksmith's van and got out of her car with the specific unhurried authority of someone who has been in situations like this before and knows that urgency is most effective when it does not look like urgency. He came to my car first, looked at me, said, "Are you okay?" I said no. She said, "Are you okay enough to do this?" I said yes. She said, "Then let's go." We walked to the front door of my house together. Diana knocked. The door was opened by Garrett, Reed's older brother, who was 38 and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been in a situation that did not resolve itself in his family's favor. He looked at Diana with the brief assessment of someone who did not recognize her and had not expected her. Diana said in the even tone of an attorney identifying herself, "I'm Diana Reeves. I represent Nora Ellison Vance, who is a marital resident of this property. I need to speak with everyone currently inside." Garrett's expression shifted. Philip appeared behind him. Then Sandra. Diana said, "Under North Carolina General Statute 14-134, the exclusion of a spouse from a marital residence without a court order is a criminal offense. The locks on this property were changed today without Ms. Ellison Vance's knowledge or consent and without any court order authorizing that change. I'm asking that access be restored immediately, or I will be calling the Guilford County Sheriff's Department." Philip started to say something. Diana said, "I would encourage you to listen rather than speak at this moment." She said it the way a person says something when they have 19 years of experience and a complete documentation file and a client who has been building a legal record for 3 months and is standing behind them on the porch of her own home on the day of her mother's funeral. Philip stopped speaking. Diana produced a document from the folder she had brought. She handed it to Philip. It was a notice of marital residence rights, a formal legal document establishing my status as a legal resident of the property, my rights under North Carolina law, and the specific legal consequences of the actions that had already been taken that day. She said, "You have the option of restoring access voluntarily right now, in which case I recommend you and your family leave the property and I will document this as resolved. Or I can make the call and we can involve law enforcement, in which case the documentation of today's events becomes part of a formal legal record. Philip looked at the document. He looked at Sandra. He looked at me. I had said nothing since we walked to the door. I had not needed to. I had done my saying 3 months ago in Diana's office in November, when my mother told me to go find out specifically. Philip said we were just preparing the house. Diana said, for what purpose? He did not have an answer for that. The locksmith, it emerged, had been paid by Garrett. The locks had been changed to a set of keys that the Vance family held. The intention, which Philip eventually articulated to Diana in the conversation that followed, in the particular way of people who have been caught in something and are recalibrating their explanation in real time, had been to create a situation in which my return to the home was conditional on a conversation with the family about the future of the marriage. He used the word conditional. I thought about Diana's word from November. Provisional. Diana told Philip in terms that were legal and precise and left no room for alternative interpretation, that creating conditions for a marital resident's access to the marital home without a court order was not a negotiating strategy. It was a criminal matter. She told him that the locks would be restored to their previous state using a locksmith of my choosing, at the Vance family's expense within the hour. She told him that any further interference with my access to the property would result in formal legal action. She told him that she had documentation of 3 months of marital residence and household contribution that would be available to any court that needed to see it. The locksmith came back. He was, to his credit, visibly uncomfortable about the return trip. I think he had understood at some point during the morning that something about the situation was not right, and having Diana and me on the porch when he arrived confirmed that instinct. He restored the locks. The Vance family left. I stood on the porch of my house on Hargrove Street and watched them drive away and felt something that was not triumph and was not relief but was closer to the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying weight for a long time and has just set it down. And the setting down is not pleasant exactly, but it is necessary and it is right. Diana stood beside me. She said, "You did everything right." I said, "My mother told me to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." I said, "She was the most organized person I have ever known. And she loved me enough to spend her last healthy days making sure I was protected." We went inside. The house looked different to me, which is irrational because nothing about it had physically changed except the locks, which had now been changed back. But the act that had been committed in it had changed something about the way I moved through the rooms. The kitchen that I had renovated. The garden I had planted. The shelves of books that were mine, that had always been mine, that I had carried into this house when I moved in 3 years ago. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the garden through the back window in the February late afternoon and I thought about my mother. She had been dead for 8 days. I had buried her 6 hours ago. I had come home to a changed lock and a family that had chosen the most vulnerable day of my life to make a move they had been planning while she was dying. And I had been ready. As she had told me to be. The separation was filed the following week. Not because of the locks specifically, though the lock-changing incident became a significant element of the legal record. Diana documented everything: the locksmith's invoice, the timeline, the neighbor's witness account, the notice she had served. It was filed because the lock-changing incident had clarified something I had been approaching slowly and arrived at fully on that Saturday afternoon. I was not in a marriage that was going to recover from this. I was in a marriage with a man who had let his family act on the worst day of my life and had not, when I called him from the porch of our house, come home. I had called Reed while Diana was inside with the Vance family completing the documentation. He picked up on the 4th ring. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said they were just trying to help. I said, "Help with what?" He did not answer. I said, "Reed, help with what?" He said, "Nora, I think we need to talk about some things." I said, "We can talk about them through our attorneys." I hung up. Diana's documentation from 3 months of preparation was the foundation of the separation proceedings. The record of my marital residence, my contributions to the household, the evidence of the improvements I had made and managed, all of it went into a file that Reed's attorney received and reviewed and had no effective response to, because the documentation said what it said and was dated and verified and could not be reconstrued. The equitable distribution took 8 months to finalize. The house was sold. My preferred outcome because I did not want to remain in it and had no particular attachment to staying in a structure that had become associated with the specific betrayal of a Saturday afternoon in February. My contributions to its improvement were documented and valued and reflected in the distribution. I received what was fair. I am not going to describe the settlement in specific terms because those specifics are private. What I will tell you is that I left that marriage with what I had contributed fairly accounted for, and with the legal record established in the 3 months my mother was dying fully intact and fully used. I live in an apartment in Greensboro now. It is smaller than the house on Hargrove Street and the kitchen is not the one I renovated and there is no garden. But there are books everywhere, on shelves, on the coffee table, on the floor beside the bed, and the walls are the colors I chose, and there is a framed photograph on the shelf above my desk that is my mother and me at the beach the summer I was 22, both of us laughing at something that is not in the frame, and it is the first thing I see every morning when I sit down to work. I teach 31 teenagers on most days that language is the most powerful tool they will ever hold. I believe this more than I did before because the most powerful document I have ever encountered was a journal I kept for 3 months at a dying woman's suggestion, and the most powerful sentence I have ever heard was "Go find out specifically," which my mother said to me in her living room in November and which I carry with me the way I carry everything she gave me, carefully, completely, with full awareness of its weight and its worth. My mother was right about most things. She was completely right about this. The people who are protected when something goes wrong are the people who found out specifically before it did. Not after. Find your attorney before you need one urgently. Document your life as though someone might one day need to read it. Understand your legal standing in your own home. And if someone who loves you tells you to prepare, because they are seeing something you are not yet ready to see, and the most loving thing they can do is make sure you are ready anyway. That is what Cora Ellison did for me in the last months of her life. I am her daughter. I know what she gave me. I will not waste any of it. If this story reached you in a way that matters, if it made you think about your own situation, your own preparation, your own document that needs updating, then it did what it was meant to do. I read every comment. Tell me where you are and what you are carrying.